When doing the research for this address, I'd read much about the deep affection and gratitude of Australian people for the Salvation Army's work. I personally have really strong childhood memories of cheery band performances on street corners, and the men and women in uniform, and in particular the fetching bonnets that were worn by the women. And when I asked my mother what they were doing, she always said, they're all people who want to help people. So if you're ever in trouble, there's a place to go. I want to recap first the history of faith-based organisations in Australia. Very briefly, Christian missionaries began arriving in Australia soon after the first colony was established in 1788. The first sustained missionary efforts started with Samuel Lee in 1815, and others followed in the early to middle 19th century. These missionaries set up missions across the continent, often with the dual intent of converting Aboriginal people to Christianity and civilising them, according to European standards of the time. The work of these early missionaries had a profound detrimental impact on Aboriginal communities and was closely tied with colonial policies at the time, a big cooperation between government and church, which included dispossession of land, removal of children, and an attempt to assimilate Aboriginal people. In this colonial period, the church and state also began a very cooperative relationship in relation to helping needy white people. As early as 1838, 5 Sisters of Charity were sent from Ireland to Sydney to minister to women convicts at what was known as the Female Factory in Parramatta. Many other Christian organisations followed to serve the marginalised, and they were the major providers of social services during that period. With the advent of depressions and wars, Australia began a move to becoming a welfare state, and the state progressively provided income support to the elderly, the unemployed, and then to single mothers as late as the 1970s, leading to a fairly comprehensive income support system. In the 1970s, particularly in the Whitlam area, we saw a very large growth in non-denominational community-based organisations developing new services and responding to changing community needs. The 90s also saw the biggest change and challenges for faith-based organisations with the development of the welfare state and the adoption of neoliberal beliefs on service provision. Summed these up. Government believes that the default position of government should be that services are most likely to be more effectively implemented by non-government providers. We have a mixed economy for welfare services, a faith-based organisation, community-based organisations, private for-profit organisations and government all play a role. And Commonwealth and state governments both have demonstrated bipartisan support for that approach. So what is a faith-based organisation? And me being particularly interested in AI, I asked ChatGPT. And ChatGPT didn't do a bad job. They describe faith-based organisations as entities that derive their inspiration and guidance from religious beliefs or spirituality to carry out their mission. They bring together people who have a belief in, trust in, and devotion to a higher power or spiritual principle, often manifested through religious traditions. And I was ready to be critical, but I left it. The core beliefs and commitments that unite many communities of faith are a belief in human dignity, a dedication to ending injustice, and a commitment to the care of the marginalised. I must say that some of these core beliefs also animate other community-based organisations. So I then asked myself, is there a difference between a faith-based organisation and other organisations providing social welfare services. In trying to answer the question, it's about someone who's well known to me. Let's call her Jane. At the time, Jane was a single mother with a very young child. On a number of occasions at that time, she overdosed. Her family did not believe that she was trying to kill herself, experimenting with different suppliers. The story is about 2 occasions on which she was found on the street after an overdose. On the first occasion, to a public hospital, and on the other occasion, to a faith-based public hospital. On both occasions, an ambulance was called and she was treated initially on the street, then transported to the emergency department of the nearest public hospital, which is the rule in Victoria. When she was taken to the secular public hospital, she arrived there without her mobile phone, without her wallet, and with 1 shoe, and her clothes had been cut to facilitate her treatment. She remembers that once she could observe her surrounds, she was made to feel as if she was an... The staff seemed to transmit a message that they would do the minimum to get her out of their way, placing deserving patients. When she was ready to leave, transport ticket and gave her back her 1 shoe. So she went home with 1 shoe. On the second occasion, Vincent's Public Hospital in Melbourne, and you would have heard from the introduction that I did sit on the board of that hospital, but that was not at the time of this incident. Her experience was very different. On discharge, she was given a taxi voucher and her clothes were replaced. The people who worked in the emergency department at St Vincent's had for a long time donated and raised funds to enable them to give patients help on discharge. She reported that they made her feel valued and didn't treat her as a nuisance. In the first instance, the people who treated her did not act with the value of human dignity. In contrast, the second hospital had deeply embedded the notion that all people should be treated with dignity. Faith-based organisations are defined by how they work. They spend time and energy to make sure that employees understand the charism of the founders. They clearly enunciate a set of values which leads to a way of working and a guide on how to make difficult decisions. They spend time on the formation of staff, not just in a technical sense, but very much in relation to values and ways of working. Board members and senior staff are given opportunities to go on pilgrimages in the steps so that they can walk in the steps of their founders. And meetings most often start with a prayer or a reflection. There are clearly non-faith-based organisations that share the values. However, in my experience, the effort and prominence of beliefs and values is more embedded in faith-based. I did a review of some of the organisations, and faith-based organisations are much more likely to include in their mission helping the most marginalised people in the community. I'm often asked whether services like Jesuit Social Services or St Vincent's Health are indeed faith-based organisations, given that they're staffed by many people from other faiths or no faith. I sought Father Andy Hamilton, SJ, and his reflection went like this. In these faith-based organisations, few of the people whom they serve have an explicit faith, and fewer are active in any church. Few too among the staff are members of the church that sponsors the organisation, and some are actually hostile to it. The story of the organisation, however, begins with people with a strong faith who were led to work with people who are marginalised. Their story, in turn, was often focused on the founders of the organisation and with the particular vision and ways of working connected with them. They were anchored in their faith in Christ. These layers are crystallised in the desire to go out to people in need and accompany them. It is a form of love, defined as wanting the other's good in all one's relationships. Faith-based organisations should never be defined by the faith of the people who work in them or by the faith of the people they serve. They are staffed by people who want to serve in an organisation that was founded by people whose faith led them to serve the disadvantaged. Over almost 15 years of being the chair of Jesuit Social Services, I've worked and watched our CEO, Dr. Julie Edwards, develop and foster a very strong Jesuit identity for the organisation she leads. She has recognised the importance of a coherent, overarching narrative that clearly communicates the organisation's purpose. In her doctoral thesis, she states that her responsibility as a CEO is to see our identity manifest through our commitment to those at the margins and our availability to respond to their needs. So getting to the topic that I suppose I was really asked, what role do they play in faith-based organisations play in contemporary Australia? Again, I went to ChatGPT, and this time I'm giving it about 7 out of 10. Many faith-based organisations provide essential services, including aged care, childcare, housing, disability support, often, and most often in Australia, with partnership in government. A large portion of Australian schools are operated by religious organisations, particularly Catholic and Anglican denominations. They provide education based on their religious values while adhering to national curriculum. Faith-based organisations often act as community hubs, fostering a sense of belonging and identity. For example, they play an essential role in helping migrants and refugees integrate into Australian society. Salvation Army and St Vincent de Paul and many others offer food, shelter and other forms of assistance to the needy. Many faith-based organisations are also registered charities in Australia, so they raise money and accept donations. Many Australians turn to their faith-based institutions for guidance on moral and ethical issues, and faith-based organisations lobby and advocate on behalf of the needy on various social and moral issues, such as opposing or supporting legislation based on their religious belief. In times of disaster or crisis, faith-based organisations are there, providing relief and support and helping rebuilding efforts. And finally, hospitals and health services in Australia, some of them are managed by religious organisations and provide care based on their religious principles. ChatGPT might have also included they undertake research and develop service models to meet the needs of the people they serve. They provide counselling on financial matters. They accompany, and accompaniment is a huge thing, they accompany those in need and at the margins and help them find housing and work and try to restore them to the set of supportive relationships that have. They provide youth services, they recruit, train and support volunteers, and they create institutions to serve their purposes. Curtin University's faith-based organisations concluded that faith-based charities make an enormous and arguably under-recognised contribution to Australia's social infrastructure and social well-being. They are by far the largest single category of a charity in Australia. They attract a proportionately larger number of volunteers than other charities, and they are more likely to be operating outside Australia. Going to the international domain, as one of our questioners wanted, former World Bank President James Wolfensohn recognised the advantages of working with faith-based organisations. Meeting with leaders of all faiths to explore their potential role in development. We, being the World Bank, are a great development institution, but it is clear to us that religious organisations have gotten us beaten, and they're his words. They are in every village. There are more of them out there. They have been there longer. They know the countries. They are out in the field, and so it is a tragedy that they are not embraced more in the overall development process. Structures collapse and agencies switch priorities against all odds, religious institutions. I then went to looking at some of the benefits that are claimed for both the government and other governments, the recipients and civil society of the work of faith-based organisations. The benefit of using faith-based organisations to deliver social services in Australia can be described from these three perspectives. Outsourcing organisations is often cheaper for government than providing these services themselves. For example, by outsourcing the Job Network Employment Service in the late 90s, the Howard government saved up to a third of the Commonwealth Employment Service. For individual service users, after reviewing research, a writer that calls himself Timothy, and not much else, concluded that faith-based organisations tend to provide more compassionate and humane treatment than government welfare departments and are less judgmental in practice and disinclined to issue sanctions. They are always of the human person at their centre, and therefore they offer care that tends to be more personal, holistic, compassionate and relation-based. They also offer a significant positive value add to civil society and to communities in general as hubs of social capital and vehicles for democratisation. They transmit and advocate for important values within their communities and act as public discourse while contributing to social cohesion. However, challenges facing faith-based organisations, and I've not done as much credit to them as the people who just sat out here in front of you, but amongst them are secularisation, which leads to a decline in the ready-made who share values and want to work with the disadvantaged. The competition for work that's created by outsourcing can lead to a position where they're simply seeking to grow. We must stay relevant to the context in which we work and continue to reflect on how we stay true to the essential motivation and ways of working of our founders. Faith-based organisations are still challenged by acknowledging their own role in the dispossession of Aboriginal people, of their land, culture and children, and their role in the sexual abuse of children by members of their faith. We must own those truths and act accordingly. So in conclusion, with abundant volunteer labour and hard-working staff, motivated either by faith or a strong set of altruistic values, faith-based organisations with a strong identity and mission have a great deal to offer. However, the sector only possesses the capacity to fulfil this promise when it is firmly rooted in both a values orientation, which may be explicitly theological, or a broader commitment to social justice and an authentic connection to grassroots local community. The conclusion that Julie Edwards reached in her doctoral thesis is that the world needs faith-based organisation. She put it simply, you are here to love and serve. I concur that faith-based organisations are here to love and serve,